If you look at the data for admissions of elite colleges before affirmative action was struck down, something jumps out immediately. At Harvard, the average admitted student from these groups were 1,540 for Asian students, 1,500 for white students, and 1,440 for black students. That's a 60-point gap from white admitteds and a 100-point gap from Asian admitteds. And notably, below the score of 1480 that at least 75% of admitted students achieved. And there's a similar story with GPA. If you are an Asian applicant ranked in the top 10% academically, the chances you were admitted was 12.7%. If you were a black applicant in the top 10% academically, 56.1%. So these findings brought me to the bigger question. Did schools like Harvard feel the need to lower the bar for black students because they just weren't achieving academically at the same rate? Or, as will be the discussion of the whole video, did Harvard need to lower the rates because black Americans on average have lower IQs than other races? Hey guys, I'm your host Dylan, and today I'm gonna answer a question that's probably gonna get me called racist immediately. I'm not trying to make any claims about racial supremacy or inferiority, but try to figure out what differences might exist. I'll look at the research, the data, and the statistics while keeping my biases out as much as possible. And by the end of this video, you'll know more than all of your friends and family when race and college comes up at the dinner table. First, I'll look to see whether or not this data is cherry-picked. Second, what social and environmental factors might be at play. Then, a fun little section with no possible controversy, looking at potential biological reasons. And as is a tradition on this channel, if I get anything wrong, make sure to leave a comment down below correcting me. And if it's true, I'll correct it in the pinned comment down there. But before we can get into any of that fun stuff about biology and environment, we have to answer the most basic question for this whole video. Is there any truth to this claim? Or am I just making a clickbaity title? And the answer is an astounding yes. And nearly everyone who's done even a smidge of research in this field has come away with the same conclusion. The paper that originally made me research this whole video was published in 2002. It found that in the United States, East Asians and their descendants had an average IQ of 106, Europeans and their descendants had an average IQ of 100, Africans and their descendants had an average IQ of 85, and when they looked at the IQs in sub-Saharan Africa, they found it to be the lowest across the whole world with an average of 70. This study is often labeled controversial, but it's not because of that finding. That part isn't a claim. It's a cold hard fact that's been replicated time and time again by others. Whether the researcher is a white supremacist, a progressive, a conservative, a black supremacist, well, maybe not a black supremacist, but virtually everyone has found a gap between black and white Americans somewhere between 10 to 20 IQ points. Where they disagree is what to do with this information. The biggest issues that people have with these studies is the validity of IQ itself and its use as an academic measurement of intelligence, as IQ in the academic world is highly contested. IQ tests are meant to assess reasoning, with it being verbal, logical, and spatial, pattern recognition, working memory, processing speed, problem solving under time constraints, and a few other categories. When it comes to what IQ actually does, most modern psychologists agree that IQ captures something real and important about human cognition. But what exactly it does and the certainty you can have is where it gets more complicated. Proponents for the use of IQ argue that IQ highly correlates with academic performance, job performance, especially in complex jobs, training success. It correlates moderately with income, and weakly, but still there, with health and longevity. So IQ captures something real. Even critics concede that few psychological measures predict such a wide variety of life outcomes as consistently as IQ does. And they've done research into the reliability of IQ tests, and they've come through pretty well. Scores are relatively stable from adolescence into adulthood, measurement methods are statistically rigorous, and they work across cultures when properly adapted. And researchers found that if someone does well on one cognitive task, they tend to do well on many others too, all supporting the idea of IQ being valuable in a potential measurement of general intelligence. However, critics have to argue against something that IQ does, or in this case doesn't do, and that's that they argue that IQ focuses far too heavily on abstract reasoning and academic style thinking, and underrepresents creativity, emotional intelligence, social intelligence, practical adaptive problem solving, and moral reasoning. Why should mastering calculus count more towards your intelligence than knowing how to communicate and navigate human relationships? Skills that arguably are more important in day-to-day life. From this critique arose two intelligence theories: the multiple intelligences theory and the triartic theory. They point out that scores are highly correlated with socioeconomic factors. Factors like cultural norms, language, schooling and familiarity with tests, and income, health, and a million other different variables, which leads to opponents of IQ arguing that IQ often measures opportunities more than ability. But enough of this talk about IQ. Instead, are societal factors at play in this IQ gap between Black Americans and white Americans? Well, the answer is complex, but first, let's start out with education, the most obvious factor. Research consistently shows that test scores are heavily influenced by class size, teacher quality, school funding, neighborhood effects, and the expectation that adults and teachers alike place on students. And all of these disproportionately negatively affect Black students. And even worse than that, they're in school less than almost every other group, with your average Asian being in school about 16 years, your average white being in school about 14 and a half years, and your average Black being in school for 13 years. And this gap matters because research has shown that every year of schooling that one completes raises IQ by around 1 to 5 points. Even on the low end, those differences can add up quickly. This leads to someone with a master's degree having, on average, 15 IQ points more than someone with a high school degree. But years in school aren't the full story. School quality matters just as much. And again, it's not a good story for Black Americans. On average across the country, schools spend about $334 more per white student than each non-white student. Mostly white schools spend about $733 more per student than mostly non-white schools. In the 2018-19 school year, the median majority white district received about $15,825 per student, and the median majority Black district received $13,587. That means that on average, white majority districts received around $1,700 more per student than Black majority districts. These gaps are furthered more when you realize that research has found that poorer districts need more resources per student because students going to poorer districts have less outside of school sources to take advantage of, like healthy families, tutors, Kumon. Because come on, no one in a poor inner city school district is taking advantage of Kumon, but students in a wealthy white suburban town definitely will. And every age group matters too, not just school age. And actually, when a kid is between 0 to 5 years old, that's the most formative part of their IQ. As it's just a true fact that early childhood development between the ages of 0 to 5 are the biggest indicators for future adult IQ. And Black children are just at a disadvantage yet again, with Black children being way more likely to experience poverty in childhood, limited access to high quality preschool, less stable housing, and less income in general. Early disadvantages that add up to less development compared to their richer counterparts. And that's the important part here. It's nothing inherent about race here. It's about having wealth or no wealth. A poor white is going to have the same disadvantage in this regard as a poor Black. And they found, just like every other study, that the average difference between a white and a Black child was around 15 IQ points. But once you statistically control for poverty, the difference dropped by 52%. After adding controls for home environment, attention given, total language spoken at home, etc., the remaining gap dropped by another 28%. And with economic and total environment controls, the difference was statistically eliminated. That's not just a small adjustment. That is an entire 15 IQ points. The difference between your median person and an Ashkenazi Jew disappeared based on societal conditions. Young children don't passively just have intelligence. They have to actively build it. Humans under 7 years old are dramatically better than every other age group at learning a language for this reason. The human brain is not fully developed at this time and is thus able to take in an immense amount of information. But once you leave that window, change is difficult to impossible. In addition to all of this, we've got stress, which is increased by economic insecurity, neighborhood violence, and racial discrimination, which leads to stress responses that negatively affect working memory, attention, and executing. all pretty important when you're taking a test. Then you've got the general health concerns, with there being major disparities between Black Americans and the rest of the country in prenatal care, childhood nutrition, and exposure to pollutants. And especially with lead, there has been a strong link between lead exposure and IQ in a negative correlation. And when you lump all this together, it makes it an incredibly hard argument to say that these IQ differences live in a vacuum and are just based on biology. And you know, speaking of that, I'll be upfront with you. I might be a little biased during this section. It's not because I agreed or disagreed personally with any of the biological reasons given when I started researching. Instead, it's because I felt uncomfortable looking at research that legitimately looked at the size of skulls. The type of stuff I was taught was white supremacist from the colonial European times. But even though I was uncomfortable doing the research and uncomfortable a little bit talking about it now, I think I did a pretty good job trying to stay unbiased and looking at the research as it was given. So first, we've got to talk about that skull and brain size, because research on this topic didn't stop in the 1800s. A study found that 4 months, 1 year, and 7 years, East Asian children in the study averaged larger cranial volumes than white children, who averaged larger cranial volumes than Black children. Within each race, the children with larger heads had the higher IQ scores by age 7. East Asian children averaged an IQ of 110, white children an average of 102, and Black children 90. And when Blacks and whites were matched for IQ, the head difference in size disappeared. But then I thought for a second, if it was just brain size that mattered for IQ, then why wouldn't elephants or blue whales have such advanced societies that they would look like advanced aliens to us? Well, the argument is that it's not about total brain size, but about the proportion of brain to total amount of body that matters. With humans, of course, coming in number 1 for that. And another study wanted to make sure that this didn't get messed up, so they did autopsy results on hundreds of white and Black Americans, found that white Americans averaged a head size of 1323 and Black Americans 1223, a 100-gram difference. And importantly, they made sure that Blacks and whites in the study were compared with similar body sizes. Thus, the difference in samples cannot be due to larger or smaller frames, respectively. But then we have to talk about the really controversial research, that being the 1994 book, The Bell Curve, which has had a little bit of a comeback recently. In it, the authors Charles Murray and Richard Hermstein argue, just like the research just given 30 seconds ago, that IQ is a valid way to look at general intelligence, and that Black Americans have shown a lower IQ and thus general intelligence than other Americans. They argue this through 2 means. First, showing that twin and adoption studies show that IQ is hereditary by between 50 to 80%. And because genes matter a lot for individuals, they argue it's plausible that genes matter for group averages too. And that's the part where it got a lot of criticism, to say the least, because in a way they were arguing that the lower IQ in African Americans could just be that their group on average has lower intelligence. Charles Murray tries to argue that he never said anything by this, but by arguing that IQ is a valid measurement for general intelligence, and it's plausible that genes could matter for group IQs, it's a little bit like you're saying Black Americans on average are going to be less intelligent. Critics claim that there's an error in reasoning here, and that they assume within group hereditability implies between group genetic differences, which sounds like a lot of big words, but basically means that they assume that genetics within a group implies that there's genetic differences between 2 groups, a move that most researchers, and that doesn't mean correctly, see as logically invalid. But let's go back even further in time, right back to when IQ and race being studied became a fiery subject. In 1969, Arthur Jensen of UK Berkeley wrote the paper, How Much Can We Boost IQ and Scholastic Achievement? In it, he argued that the huge efforts of compensatory education and special resources given to people of past discrimination had very little to no lasting impacts on these groups' IQs in the long term. And he said it should make researchers question the basis on which these programs were started. He, like the book after him, didn't say exactly what genetic could be causing these IQ differences. No one wants to deal with that. But it's just stating that the current theory between Black and white IQ differences being environmental just doesn't make sense with the data. Of course, a lot has happened since the 1960s, and a lot more research has been done into non-genetic reasons for IQ, but but many researchers still hold to the arguments of Arthur. And so in general, there is some uncomfortable evidence that there could be IQ differences between races, which is really strange because race is not genetic, and specifically how we make the categories. Of course, genetics plays into the skin color a person has, but there's more genetic diversity within Africa than there is between a South American and an Asian. So hopefully more research can be done into exactly what genetic reasons could be causing this difference, but it's surely not an argument that we can just deny. So where does this leave us all? Yes, research shows that Black Americans have lower IQs than most other groups. Yes, most researchers say that IQ is a valuable measurement, but there's heavy disagreement on what it does measure and how good it is at measuring specific things. And there's evidence that a multitude of socioeconomic factors are the big causers for this gap in IQ. But there's some uncomfortable research that there may be something more genetic and biological to these IQ differences. And if hearing this research makes you uncomfortable, it's worth asking why it does. We already accept that people with much lower IQs than the average aren't morally inferior, deserve less respect, or less deserving of dignity. Maybe this reveals something deeper that people believe about IQ and the value that it gives to someone. But a fairly common belief that people had a few hundred years ago is that God gifted white people with intelligence and gifted Black people with athletics. Seems a little strange, seems pretty racist to me. But what if Black Americans were actually made to be more athletic? Specifically, what if Black slaves were specifically bred by their owners to be bigger and stronger? They didn't really care if their property was intelligent, but they probably cared if they could carry a bigger load. But it seems kind of racist to suggest something like that. But there's actually a complex argument about whether or not slave owners did this, and as a reason for the domination of Black athletes in sports today. It's not as cut and dry as you might first think. You can check that video out right here. And don't forget to not be a supremacist, give attention to little kids to increase their IQ, and think controversy. I'll catch you over in this video right here.